The search for 19-year-old Tommy Carter was exactly 48 hours old when the rain turned to sleet. My name is Elias Thorne. For 8 years, I was a paramedic on the south side of Chicago. I spent my 20s pulling shattered bodies out of twisted metal on the Dan Ryan Expressway and trying to pack gunshot wounds in cramped, suffocating apartments. I thought I knew what stress was. I thought I knew what it felt like to look death in the eye and negotiate. But the city is a machine. It is predictable in its violence. When the burnout finally cracked me in half, I traded the concrete grid for the sprawling, untamed wilderness of Onyx Peak National Forest in Oregon, thinking I was finding peace. I was dead wrong. Out here, the violence isn't machine. It's a living, breathing organism, and it is far older than we are. It was late October, the time of year when the Pacific Northwest turns into a dark, freezing purgatory of fog and bruised skies. Tommy Carter had hiked up the North Ridge Trail 2 days ago with nothing but a day pack and a foolish sense of invincibility. He never made it back to his car. I was working Sector 4, a brutal, jagged expanse of ravines and ancient Douglas firs known locally as the Devil's Throat. The terrain here was a nightmare of slit granite, hidden drop-offs, and underbrush so thick you had to fight it for every single inch. My thighs burned and my lungs ached in the thinning, freezing air. The sun was dipping below the canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to stretch and contort across the forest floor. I paused, leaning heavily on my trekking poles, and pulled my radio to my mouth. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I'm hitting the perimeter of the throat. Visibility is dropping fast. No sign of the Carter kid. Over?" Static hissed back at me. Not the soft crackle of a bad connection, but a harsh, aggressive hiss that sounded like bacon frying in a pan. "Dispatch, Unit 4, do you copy? Over?" More static. I was in a dead zone. That wasn't unusual in the throat, but it always made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I checked my GPS unit. The screen flickered, the topographic map glitching before rendering entirely blank. No trails, no contour lines, just a gray, empty grid. I cursed under my breath and smacked the side of the device, but it remained stubbornly blank. As I stared at the dead screen, the temperature plummeted. It wasn't a gradual evening chill. It was a violent, instantaneous drop that felt like walking into an industrial meat freezer. My breath plumed in thick white clouds. Then, the silence hit. It didn't fade. It dropped like a guillotine. 1 second, the forest was alive with the roaring wind, the drumming of sleet against the pine needles, and the rushing of a distant creek. The next second, it was a vacuum. Absolute, suffocating audio nullity. The sleet was still hitting my jacket, but it made no sound. The wind was still thrashing the treetops, but it was entirely mute. The quiet was so heavy, it created a physical pressure inside my eardrums. My stomach dropped into my boots. 7 months ago, on my first day at Onyx Peak, my supervisor, a grizzled 30-year veteran named Hutch, had locked the door to the dispatch office and handed me a list of unwritten rules. He told me the training manuals kept you alive during the day, but his rules kept you alive after dark. Rule number 1, Hutch had said, his voice deadly serious, smelling of stale coffee and pipe tobacco. If you are off trail and find a staircase leading to nowhere, do not look at it, do not photograph it, and walk away. Rule number 2, if the forest goes completely, unnaturally dead silent, you stop moving. You close your eyes. You do not open them until you hear a bird chirp. I don't care if you feel something breathing on your neck. Keep them shut. Standing in the freezing, unnatural void of the Devil's Throat, I squeezed my eyes shut. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My EMT training fought against my survival instincts. It's just an atmospheric pressure anomaly, my rational brain screamed. It's microclimate weather distortion. But my lizard brain knew better. I felt a sudden, distinct draft brush past my left ear. It smelled like ozone, wet copper, and rotting meat. Something was standing right next to me. I could feel the displacement of the air. "Don't open them," I prayed, my gloved hands gripping my trekking poles so hard my knuckles popped. "Do not open them." And then the silence broke. Tweet, tweet, tweet. 3 sharp, piercing blasts of a Fox 40 survival whistle rang out, slicing through the void. Instantly, the sound of the wind and the sleet rushed back into my ears, hitting me like a physical wave. I gasped, my eyes flying open. I spun around, sweeping my heavy maglite across the dense tree line. 3 blasts, the universal backcountry signal for a life-threatening emergency. It had come from deep inside the basin, down in the darkest, steepest part of the throat. Tommy Carter. He had a whistle on his pack inventory. He was down there. I unclipped my radio, my thumb hovering over the button. I needed to mark the location, to leave a breadcrumb trail before I descended. But then the echo returned. Hutch's rule number 3 echoed in my mind, his gravelly voice dripping with dread. The Mockingbird Protocol. If you hear a distress whistle, you wait for the echo. If it sounds like a whistle, you go do your job. But if the echo sounds like a woman crying, you turn your radio to static, you put your head down, and you walk due east for 20 minutes. You do not investigate. You walk away, Elias. I don't care who you think is down there. The sound waves from the whistle bounced off the granite walls of the basin and rolled back up toward me. It was not a whistle. It was the jagged, throat-tearing sound of a woman screaming in absolute, unspeakable agony. It was a raw, wet sound, vibrating with genuine terror. It was a sound I had heard a dozen times in the back of my ambulance, the sound of someone realizing they are going to die. I froze. My thumb trembled on the radio. "Walk due east," my brain ordered. "Follow the rule." Hutch wasn't lying. Down in the basin, the screaming continued, but it was shifting. It was morphing from a woman's scream into a young man's frantic cries. "Help! Oh God, please! My leg is broken! Please, is someone up there?" It was Tommy. It had to be. I looked at my compass. East was back up the ridge, back to the marked trail, back to safety. If I walked east, I would live. But if I walked east, the kid down there, a kid who was terrified, freezing, and crying out for salvation, would die alone in the dark. I am a paramedic. I took an oath. You don't walk away from someone bleeding out because you're scared of the dark. "Screw the rules," I muttered, my breath pluming in the harsh light of my flashlight. I clipped my radio to my chest, tightened the straps on my heavy Sarpack, and plunged off the edge of the trail, descending straight down into the Devil's Throat. The terrain fought me immediately. The slope was a 45-degree drop covered in slick pinades and loose shale. I slid, scrambled, and tore my hands on thorny underbrush, descending rapidly into the gloom. The fog down here was thick, pooling in the basin like sour milk, reducing the beam of my high-powered flashlight to a weak, hazy glow. "Tommy!" I roared, my voice swallowed by the sheer vastness of the ravine. "I'm a park ranger. I'm coming down to you. Keep yelling." "Help me! It hurts! Please!" The voice was closer now, maybe 200 yards. But there was something wrong with it. It was too loud. It lacked the breathless, exhausted quality of a kid who had been lost for 2 days in freezing temperatures. It sounded as clear as if he were speaking into a microphone. I pushed through a dense thicket of dead rhododendrons, the branches clawing at my tactical jacket. I stumbled into a small, muddy clearing at the absolute bottom of the basin. The creek rushed wildly to my left, swollen with the freezing rain. I swept my flashlight across the clearing. My beam caught a flash of bright red nylon. "Tommy!" I sprinted forward, my boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing mud. It was Tommy's backpack. I recognized the brand and the color from the missing person flyer. But it wasn't just dropped. It was standing perfectly upright on a flat rock, carefully arranged around the backpack, laid out with meticulous, obsessive precision, were Tommy's clothes. His hiking boots, his socks, his fleece jacket, his cargo pants. They were arranged in the shape of a person laying on the ground, but they were completely empty. There was no blood. No signs of an animal attack. Just an empty uniform, laid out like a sick museum display. The air in the clearing was inexplicably warm, smelling strongly of sulfur and something sweet like rotting fruit. "Tommy?" I whispered, my medical training short-circuiting as my brain tried to process the impossible scene. "Help me! It hurts! Please!" The voice didn't come from the woods. It came from directly above me. I snapped my flashlight up into the canopy of the massive Douglas fir towering over the clearing. Perched on a thick branch, about 30 feet off the ground, was a figure. It was wearing Tommy's bright yellow rain shell, but it was entirely the wrong shape. The limbs were far too long, dangling off the branch like a spider's legs, possessing too many joints. The hands gripping the bark were pale, hairless, and ended in thick, dark talons that dug deeply into the wood. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't reach for the bear spray on my hip. Complete, paralyzing terror locked my muscles. The thing in the tree slowly turned its head to look down at me. Beneath the hood of Tommy's rain shell, there was no face, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin stretched tight over a skull, completely devoid of eyes, a nose, or a mouth. Yet, from the smooth flesh where its throat should be, a voice emanated. It wasn't Tommy's voice anymore. It was my voice, perfect, exact, and laced with my own distinct Chicago accent. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, the faceless thing mimicked, its head tilting to the side at an unnatural broken angle. "I have a distress signal, audio only, proceeding to investigate. Over." Then, the creature's smooth face split open. A vertical tear ripped down the center of its head, revealing rows of jagged, translucent teeth. From that impossible maw, it let out the exact, ear-piercing sound of a Fox 40 survival whistle. "Tweet! Tweet! Tweet!" The creature launched itself from the branch, dropping straight down toward me in the dark, and as its shadow eclipsed my flashlight beam, all I could hear was Hutch's voice in my head. "You should have walked east." The human body is not designed to process the impossible. When confronted with an apex predator that defies the fundamental laws of biology, the brain simply short-circuits. It strips away millions of years of higher-order reasoning, philosophy, and medical training in a fraction of a second, leaving only the raw, violent imperative of the brainstem: survive. As the faceless, multi-jointed nightmare dropped from the canopy of the Douglas fir, my survival instinct finally kicked in, overriding my paralysis. I didn't think, I reacted. I threw my weight backward, planting my boots in the freezing mud, and propelled myself into a desperate backward roll. The creature hit the ground exactly where I had been standing a millisecond prior. The impact was horrifyingly heavy, a sickening wet thud that shook the earth, devoid of the natural grace of a mountain lion or a bear. It hit the ground like a sack of wet cement. In the chaotic strobe of my dropped flashlight, I saw its limbs contort and snap into place. The joints popped with the sound of cracking dry wood. It was wearing Tommy Carter's yellow rain shell, but the garment was stretched taut over a skeletal frame that was entirely wrong. It had no face, only that vertical, jagged maw that was now hissing with my own voice. "Dispatch, Unit 4, proceeding." I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my tactical pants soaking through with freezing water. My right hand slapped against my hip, my fingers instinctively finding the canister of UDAP bear spray holstered on my belt. In Chicago, I carried a trauma kit and a radio. Out here, I carried a 9-ounce can of aerosolized hellfire designed to stop a charging 800-pound grizzly. The creature coiled its impossibly long limbs, preparing to lunge. I ripped the safety clip off the canister, raised my arm, and depressed the trigger. A thick orange cloud of 2.0% capsaicinoid pepper spray erupted from the nozzle, expanding instantly in the heavy, damp air. It hit the creature squarely in the center of its smooth, featureless face, just as it leaped forward. The result was not a roar of pain, but a violently distorted shriek of digital feedback. It sounded like a microphone being held directly up to a massive concert speaker, a deafening, high-pitched squeal that made my ears ring. The creature thrashed wildly in midair, its trajectory thrown off. It crashed into the muddy bank of the creek, tearing at its face with thick, pale talons that looked like sharpened bone. The ambient wind caught the edge of the orange cloud, blowing a localized mist of pepper spray back into my own face. My eyes immediately began to water, and my lungs seized as the brutal, burning chemical coated my throat. Coughing violently, I snatched my heady maglite from the mud, turned my back on the clearing, and ran. I didn't jog. I didn't hike. I sprinted into the sheer 45-degree incline of the Devil's Throat. The ascent was a nightmare. The ground was a treacherous slurry of loose shale, dead pine needles, and freezing mud. Every step I took upward resulted in sliding half a step back. I threw my trekking poles aside. They were useless here, and used my hands, clawing at exposed roots, sharp rocks, and thorny underbrush. Brambles tore through my gloves, slicing into my palms, but the adrenaline masked the pain. My paramedic brain, a cold, analytical passenger and a panicked host, began to assess my physical condition. Heart rate, 180 BPM and climbing. Respiration, shallow, rapid. Blood pressure, skyrocketing. Lactic acid buildup in the quadriceps, imminent. If I kept this pace up the sheer face of the ravine, I was going to induce a cardiac event. I was a fit guy, but no one sprints up the throat in 30-degree weather wearing 40 pounds of SAR gear. But then, from the blackness below me, I heard the sound of tearing bark. It wasn't climbing the mud, it was climbing the trees. "Elias!" The voice drifted up through the dark, cutting through the howling wind. But it wasn't my voice anymore, and it wasn't Tommy Carter's. It was a woman's voice. Exhausted, frantic, and laced with the chaotic background noise of a busy emergency room. "Elias, I need you in Trauma 3. He's crashing. Get the crash cart, Elias, please." I stumbled, my boots slipping on a wet root, my chin slamming hard into the mud. I tasted blood, hot and metallic. That was Sarah, my old EMT partner in Chicago. I hadn't heard her voice in over a year. The memory it dragged up, a 19-year-old kid bleeding out on a gurney from a drive-by shooting, the smell of sterile alcohol and copper, the rhythmic, terrifying flatline of the ECG monitor, hit me like a physical blow to the chest. How could it know that? How could a thing living in the dark, ancient woods of Oregon know the voice of a paramedic in Cook County? "He's dying, Elias. You're letting him die!" The creature shrieked from the darkness below, perfectly mimicking the panicked inflection of Sarah's voice. The sound was getting closer. I could hear the heavy, unnatural thwack of its talons sinking into the wood of the trees as it leapt from trunk to trunk, ascending the ravine without ever touching the ground. "Shut up!" I screamed, pulling myself up by a thick rhododendron root, my muscles screaming in protest. "Just shut up!" I forced my legs to pump, scrambling up the last steep incline. The tree line began to thin slightly, and the sheer verticality of the throat began to level out into the rugged, rocky terrain of the upper ridge. I broke through a line of dense ferns and collapsed on the relatively flat, gravelly surface of the North Ridge Trail. I rolled onto my back, gasping desperately for air. The freezing sleet washed the mud and blood from my face, doing nothing to cool the raging inferno in my lungs. I unclipped my radio with a trembling hand, thumbing the dial. "Dispatch? Dispatch, this is Thorne. Emergency. Code red. Do you copy?" The radio hissed, a bed of static. But then a voice broke through. "Unit 4, this is dispatch. We copy you loud and clear. What is your status? Over." Relief, pure and absolute, washed over me. I pressed the button, coughing up a mouthful of saliva and dirt. "Dispatch, I am under attack in Sector 4, top of the throat. Suspect it's hostile. I need immediate armed extraction. Carter is gone. I repeat, Tommy Carter is a KIA. Send Hutch. Send everyone." The radio crackled. The voice that replied was calm, utterly, unnervingly calm. Copy that, Unit 4. We are sending an ambulance. Please wait right there, Elias. We are sending the ambulance. He's crashing, Elias. You're letting him die. I threw the radio away from me as if it were a venomous snake. It skittered across the gravel, the speaker continuing to emit the horrific, spliced-together audio of the dispatcher's calm voice and Sarah's panicked screaming. It had hacked the frequency, or worse, it was projecting the radio signals itself. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight beam cutting through the driving sleet. I was fully exposed on the ridge. I couldn't outrun it all the way back to the main ranger station. It was over 6 miles of treacherous terrain. I needed shelter. I needed a fortified position. My mind raced over the topographic map of Sector 4. A quarter-mile north of my current position was Outpost Echo. It was an old, decommissioned Forestry Service cabin built in the 1970s. It hadn't been used for official operations in decades, but it had 4 solid log walls, a heavy oak door, and a corrugated tin roof. It was the only chance I had. I ran. My legs felt like lead, my chest burning with every ragged breath. The forest around me was a chaotic blur of black trunks and gray sleet. The temperature was dropping further, the rain turning entirely to snow. The wind howled through the canopy, masking the sounds of pursuit. I didn't know if the creature was directly behind me or flanking me through the trees. Up ahead, illuminated by the strobe of my maglite, the silhouette of Outpost Echo emerged from the gloom. It was small, no bigger than a single-car garage, sitting on a raised concrete foundation. The windows were boarded up with thick, weathered plywood. I threw myself against the heavy oak door, my shoulder screaming in protest. It was locked. I stepped back, raised my heavy steel-toed boot, and kicked the lock mechanism with every ounce of strength I had left. The ancient, rusted deadbolt splintered the wooden frame, and the door violently swung open. I stumbled inside, the darkness of the cabin swallowing me. I spun around, grabbed the heavy iron handle, and slammed the door shut. There was no deadbolt anymore, so I threw my entire body weight against the wood. My flashlight illuminated the interior. It was a single room. A rusted wood stove sat in the corner, next to a rotting cot and a heavy metal desk. The desk, I grunted to myself. I abandoned the door for exactly 3 seconds, sprinting to the heavy steel desk. I grabbed it by the edge and dragged it across the wooden floorboards, the metal screeching loudly. I shoved it flush against the door, creating a makeshift barricade. I then grabbed the heavy cast-iron wood stove, ignoring the strain in my lower back, and toppled it over, wedging it against the desk. I backed away, my chest heaving, the beam of my flashlight shaking violently in my hands. The cabin was silent. The thick logs and boarded windows muffled the howling wind outside. I waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The only sound was the frantic drumming of my own heart and the ragged rasp of my breathing. Then I heard the footsteps. They weren't the heavy, clumsy thuds of a bear, nor the light, stealthy padding of a cougar. They were the distinct, rhythmic crunches of a bipedal creature walking in heavy hiking boots over the gravel outside the cabin. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps circled the perimeter of the cabin slowly, methodically. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just mimicking voices. It was mimicking human movement. It was wearing Tommy's boots. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the barricaded door. I raised my flashlight, aiming the beam squarely at the center of the heavy oak wood. I unholstered my heavy tactical knife, my knuckles white as bone. I had survived the worst the city of Chicago could throw at me. I was not going to die in a rotting shack in the woods. Tap, tap, tap. A single, elongated talon tapped gently against the wood of the door. The sound was sickeningly playful. Elias. A low, gravelly voice rumbled from the other side of the door. My heart skipped a beat. It was Hutch. Elias, open the door, son, Hutch's voice said, perfectly capturing his quiet authority, the slight wheeze of his pipe-damaged lungs. It's freezing out here. I got your radio call. I brought the trauma kit. Just open the door." "You're not him," I whispered, my voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. "Rule number 3, Elias," the thing outside the door continued, Hutch's voice warping slightly, the pitch dropping into a demonic, unnatural baritone. "I told you to walk east. Why didn't you walk east? I have the boy. We are so cold." The tapping stopped. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. I backed away from the door, my legs finally giving out. I slid down the back wall of the cabin, hitting the dusty floorboards. I kept my flashlight trained on the door, refusing to blink. As I sat there, trying to control my breathing, the beam of my light caught something on the floor near the overturned desk. It was an old, leather-bound book, coated in decades of dust. The impact of the desk must have knocked it loose from a hidden compartment. I reached out and pulled the book toward me. It was a ranger's logbook, identical to the one I had seen down in the impossible tent. The date on the cover was faded, but I could make out the year, 1984. I opened the cover. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age. The handwriting was cramped, frantic, and barely legible, written in faded blue ink. October 14th. The mockingbird took Sarah tonight. It sounded just like her baby crying in the woods. She broke protocol. She went into the throat. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. It's out there right now, walking around the cabin. It's using her voice. It's telling me how much it hurts. It wants me to open the door. I flipped the page, my hands shaking violently. October 15th. The static on the radio isn't a dead zone. It's a localized electromagnetic field. It generates it. That's how it isolates us. It feeds on the empathy. It uses the rescue response as a hunting mechanism. It's parasite that preys on human compassion. I flipped to the final page. There were no more dates, just a single sentence written in jagged, desperate strokes that had torn through the paper. Don't look at the ceiling. The air in the cabin suddenly grew freezing cold. A drop of thick, viscous liquid hit the center of the logbook in my lap, smearing the ink. It smelled of ozone, copper, and rotting meat. Very, very slowly, I tilted my flashlight upward, illuminating the heavy wooden rafters above my head. The beam of my maglite cut through the dusty, freezing air of Outpost Echo, tracking slowly up the rotting log wall, past the rusted iron stovepipe, and finally illuminating the heavy timber rafters. The human mind has a built-in safety mechanism. When it encounters something so fundamentally repulsive, so contradictory to the natural order of the world, it attempts to edit the image. It tries to rationalize the input. "It's just a shadow," my brain pleaded. "It's a trick of the light, an optical illusion caused by adrenaline and exhaustion." But the halogen beam of the flashlight was unforgivingly bright. The ceiling of the cabin was not bare wood. It was coated in a thick, glistening layer of black, resinous webbing, resembling the funnel web of a massive subterranean spider. But the webbing wasn't just structural, it was an adhesive, holding a macabre tapestry of human debris against the rafters. I saw a faded blue Patagonia fleece from the 1990s, a crushed aluminum canteen, a child's red knit winter cap, a shattered compass. And stretching between them, binding the hollow, empty garments together, were long, translucent strands of that foul-smelling, copper-scented slime. And clinging to the center of that horrific nest, directly above my head, was the mockingbird. It hadn't been at the door. It had never been outside. The tapping, the pacing, the perfect, gravelly mimicry of Hutch's voice. It had thrown its voice, bouncing the sound waves against the heavy oak door from inside the cabin. It had crawled down the wide, rusted masonry of the chimney while I was desperately dragging the desk across the floor to lock myself in with it. It was suspended upside down, its pale, multi-jointed limbs spread wide, its talons sunk deep into the timber. The yellow rain shell it wore hung limply downward, revealing its impossibly long, emaciated torso. Its skin was the color of drowned flesh, smooth and devoid of any recognizable musculature. As the light hit its faceless head, the vertical slit of its mouth peeled open. "Rule number 3, Elias," it whispered, the voice dropping from the ceiling, echoing off the floorboards to make it sound like it was standing right beside me. "We are so cold." It detached from the ceiling and plummeted. I didn't have time to scream. I barely had time to move. I rolled violently to my left, just as the creature slammed into the floorboards where I had been sitting. The impact was deafening, splintering the ancient wood. The maglite slipped from my grip, rolling across the floor and coming to a stop against the wall, casting a harsh, low-angle strobe across the cabin. The shadows danced erratically, turning the small room into a chaotic nightmare of stretching limbs and flashing teeth. The creature scrambled toward me on all fours, its joints popping and snapping with that horrific dry wood sound. Up close, the smell was paralyzing, a suffocating wave of ammonia, rotting pine, and old dried blood. It lunged, a pale talon swiping in a wide arc. I raised my left arm defensively. The talons tore through the heavy Kevlar-reinforced fabric of my tactical jacket like it was wet tissue paper, slicing deep into my forearm. The pain was immediate and blinding, a hot white flare of agony that shocked my system. "Get the crash cart!" the thing shrieked, its voice morphing flawlessly back into Sarah, my old EMT partner. "He's flatlining!" With a guttural roar that tore my throat, I drove my right hand forward, burying my heavy tactical knife deep into the center of the creature's smooth, featureless chest. There was no resistance. The blade sank into its flesh as if plunging into thick, cold gelatin. It didn't bleed red. A spray of freezing, viscous black fluid erupted from the wound, splashing across my face. It burned like battery acid, blinding my right eye and searing my skin. The creature let out another digitized, shrieking squeal of feedback and thrashed backward, tearing the knife from my grip. It slammed into the overturned cast-iron stove, its long limbs tangling in the debris. I didn't hesitate. The cabin was a death trap. I had barricaded the door perfectly, and now that barricade was the only thing standing between me and the freezing wilderness outside. I scrambled to my feet, my left arm hanging limply at my side, blood pouring down my fingers. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy steel desk I had wedged against the door. It shrieked against the floorboards, moving only a fraction of an inch. Behind me, the creature was righting itself, its bones cracking as it contorted its spine to face me. "Dispatch, Unit 4, it gurgled, its voice now wet and thick with the black fluid bubbling from its chest. "I am under attack. Send Hutch. Send everyone." "Move, move, move!" I screamed at myself, planting my boots against a floorboard and pushing the desk with my good shoulder. The adrenaline was hitting its absolute peak, allowing me to access hysterical strength. The heavy desk finally groaned and slid back just enough to clear the doorframe. I grabbed the iron handle, ripped the heavy oak door open, and threw myself out into the night. The weather had escalated from a freezing sleet to a full-blown, blinding whiteout blizzard. The wind hit me like a physical wall, howling with the force of a freight train. Within seconds, the blood on my face and arm began to freeze, stiffening my jacket. I ran blindly into the storm. I didn't have my flashlight. I didn't have my knife. I didn't have my radio. I was a dead man walking, sustained only by the primal terror propelling my legs forward. The North Ridge Trail was completely buried under 6 inches of fresh, rapidly accumulating snow. Navigation was impossible. The towering Douglas firs were just vague, darker shapes in the swirling white chaos. I was moving strictly on muscle memory and the vague topographical map etched into my brain from months of studying Sector 4. I needed to keep ascending. If I went down, I would fall back into the Devil's Throat. If I kept going up, I would eventually hit the Onyx Peak access road. Behind me, swallowed by the roaring wind, I heard the heavy oak door of the cabin smash open. "Elias!" The voice carried over the storm, amplified by whatever biological mechanism the creature used to project sound. But it wasn't Sarah anymore, and it wasn't Hutch. It was my mother. "Elias, honey, come back inside. It's freezing out there. You're going to catch your death." My mother had been dead for 6 years. She died of pancreatic cancer in a sterile hospice room in Evanston, Illinois. Hearing her voice, warm, comforting, laced with that familiar maternal worry, out here in the unforgiving void of the Oregon wilderness was a psychological violation so profound it made my knees buckle. "It's a parasite that preys on human compassion," the old logbook had warned. "It feeds on the empathy." "Close your ears," I sobbed aloud, burying my head in my right shoulder and forcing myself to trudge forward. The snow was up to my calves now. "It's not real. It's not her." "Please, Eli," the voice pleaded, sounding closer now. "I'm so frightened in the dark." I pushed harder, scrambling up a steep, rocky embankment. The air was getting thinner, the wind slicing through my layers and sapping my core body temperature. Hypothermia is an insidious killer. It starts with shivering, but it quickly moves to the brain, causing confusion, lethargy, and a bizarre, paradoxical feeling of warmth. I could feel the edges of my vision starting to narrow, a heavy, gray exhaustion creeping into my muscles. I stumbled over a buried root and crashed into the snow, my injured arm flaring with agonizing pain. I lay there for a moment, the snow pressing against my cheek. It felt so soft. It would be so easy to just close my eyes for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes to catch my breath. No. I bit my own lip hard enough to draw blood, using the sharp sting to ground myself. I forced myself to my knees and looked up. The wind had briefly broken, the swirling snow parting like a theatrical curtain to reveal a small, strangely peaceful grove of ancient cedars. The trees here were massive, their sweeping branches creating a canopy that blocked out the worst of the storm. And sitting perfectly in the center of the grove, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the clouds, was a staircase. It wasn't a ruin, it wasn't the remnants of a burned-down cabin. It was a pristine, meticulously constructed staircase. It had 12 steps, built of rich, polished mahogany, covered in a plush, deep crimson carpet. It had an ornate brass banister that gleamed flawlessly in the dark. It looked as though it had been violently ripped from a Victorian mansion and dropped gently into the middle of the untamed wilderness. It led up to absolutely nothing, just the empty, freezing air. "Rule number 1, Hutch's voice slammed into my consciousness. "If you come across a staircase leading to nowhere, do not approach it. Do not look at the top step. Turn around and walk away." But as I knelt there in the snow, freezing to death, bleeding, and hunted by an apex predator wearing a teenager's skin, the staircase didn't look terrifying. It looked inviting. There was a soft golden glow radiating from the top step, and the air around the structure wasn't freezing. It was warm. I could smell cinnamon, burning firewood, and the distinct, comforting scent of my childhood home. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a television playing a baseball game. "Just climb the stairs, Elias," my exhausted brain whispered. "It's safe up there. It's warm. The mockingbird can't get you up there." I took a staggering step toward it. The warmth washed over my frozen face, instantly soothing the burning ache in my lungs. It was a siren song, perfectly calibrated to exploit the deepest, most desperate desires of a dying man. I reached out, my trembling fingers inches away from the gleaming brass banister. Then I heard it, a faint, subtle sound coming from beneath the stairs. The sound of a wet, ragged breath, and the distinct dry wood pop of a joint shifting in the dark. It was a trap. Another hunting mechanism. The mockingbird wasn't the only thing in this forest. The woods were an ecosystem of impossible apex predators, and this one used comfort, not empathy, as its bait. I violently ripped my gaze away from the stairs, staring strictly at my own boots. I bit down on a scream of frustration and terror, turned my back on the golden warmth, and forced myself back into the howling, freezing blizzard. I trudged for what felt like hours, though it could have been 20 minutes. I had lost all concept of time. My left arm was completely numb. My legs moved mechanically, devoid of conscious thought. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts, and I was using the last dregs of my energy just to stay upright. Suddenly, a bright, unnatural light flared in the distance. It was a brilliant, blinding crimson, a road flare. It hissed violently in the snowstorm, casting a bloody halo against the whiteout. I stumbled toward it, my vision swimming. If it was the creature mimicking a flare, I didn't care anymore. I was done. The forest had won. As I breached the halo of the red light, a heavy, dark figure emerged from the snowdrift behind the flare. "Stop right there! Don't take another step!" a voice roared over the wind. It was a man. He was wearing the heavy, dark green winter parka of the Onyx Peak Rangers. He had a heavy-duty Winchester 12-gauge shotgun raised and aimed squarely at my chest. It was Hutch. His face was pale, his beard encrusted with ice. He looked terrified. "Hutch!" I gasped, falling to my knees in the snow, raising my good hand in surrender. "It's me, Elias! Help me!" Hutch didn't lower the weapon. He racked the pump, the universal sound of impending violence chambering a heavy slug. He kept the barrel trained directly on my face. His eyes were wide, darting from my bleeding arm to my face, scanning me with a paranoid intensity that chilled me deeper than the blizzard. "Hutch, put the gun down! It's me!" I pleaded, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. "The creature uses faces now," Hutch yelled, his voice raw. "I saw it. I saw it wear Tommy's skin. If you are Elias Thorne, you prove it to me right now, or I blow a hole through your chest and let the mountain take you." I stared down the dark, hollow barrel of the shotgun. He wasn't bluffing. He had seen the horrors of the forest. He knew exactly what the mockingbird was capable of. "Prove it," Hutch roared, his finger tightening on the trigger. "What did you do before you came here? Tell me right now." "I was a paramedic," I screamed back, coughing up snow and bile. "Chicago. I worked at Dan Ryan." "The thing knows that," Hutch countered, stepping closer. "It pulled voices from your head. It projects memories. Tell me something it wouldn't know. Tell me something only you and I talked about in that room on your first day." My brain scrambled, fighting through the thick fog of hypothermia. The memory of that first day, the smell of his pipe tobacco, the locked door. "You gave me 3 rules," I yelled, my voice breaking. "Stairs, silence, and the mockingbird. You told me you pulled 32 bodies out of these woods, and there were 14 you never found." Hutch stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. The wind howled around us, the crimson light of the flare reflecting in his pale eyes. Slowly, his shoulders dropped. He lowered the barrel of the shotgun and let out a long, ragged exhale. "Jesus Christ, Elias," he muttered, stepping forward and grabbing me by the collar of my jacket, hauling me to my feet. "You look like hell." "We have to go," I babbled, grabbing his heavy parka. "It's behind me. It was in the cabin. It mimicked my mother, Hutch. It knows everything." "I know," Hutch said grimly, supporting my weight as we began to move up the incline. "I found Tommy's body an hour ago, what was left of it. The radio signals are entirely jammed. We're on our own." "Where are we going?" I asked, my legs buckling with every step. "The old mining tunnel at the peak," Hutch said, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. "It has a heavy steel grate. If we can get inside and lock it, we can wait out the storm. It's the only defensible position left." As he spoke, the red light of the flare sputtered and died, plunging us back into the absolute, crushing darkness of the blizzard. And from the darkness, perfectly synchronized and surrounding us from all 360 degrees, a dozen voices whispered in unison, "Rule number 3, Elias. Rule number 3. We weren't just being hunted anymore. We were surrounded. There is a specific kind of terror that comes not from the presence of a threat, but from its geometry. Being hunted by a single predator is a linear equation. You run in the opposite direction. But when the darkness itself begins to speak, when the threat surrounds you in a perfect, suffocating 360-degree radius, the mathematics of survival collapse. Rule number 3, Elias. The voices did not overlap in a chaotic jumble. They spoke in absolute, terrifying unison. It was a choir comprised of my dead mother, my former paramedic partner Sarah, Tommy Carter, and the dispatcher. The synchronization was flawless, a digitized harmonic nightmare broadcasting through the howling Oregon blizzard. "Keep your eyes on my back, Thorne," Hutch roared, his gravelly voice cutting through the unnatural chorus. "Do not look into the tree line. You look at the center of my coat and you do not stop moving." I grabbed the heavy nylon webbing of Hutch's parka with my good right hand, anchoring myself to him. My left arm was completely useless, hanging limply at my side, the deep laceration from the creature's talons burning with a cold, venomous fire. The black fluid it had bled onto me had frozen, coating my jacket in a stiff, foul-smelling crust. We trudged upward into the teeth of the storm. The snow was thigh-deep, every step an agonizing negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. My core temperature was dropping to a critical threshold. The violent shivering had stopped 10 minutes ago, a terrifying clinical sign. When the body stops shivering, it means the hypothalamus has given up trying to generate heat. It is the waiting room for a coma. "Harrison." The unified chorus abruptly ceased, replaced by a single solitary voice drifting from the black pines to our left. It was a woman's voice, older, soft, carrying a slight southern drawl. "Harrison, my legs are so cold. Why did you leave me in the ravine, Harrison? You promised you'd find me." Hutch froze. The massive, immovable mountain of a man stopped dead in his tracks. I slammed into his back, nearly knocking us both over into the drifts. I looked up. Hutch's shotgun was trembling. I had never seen the man show an ounce of fear, let alone vulnerability, but the posture of his broad shoulders had entirely collapsed. "Hutch," I rasped, my teeth chattering so hard I bit my own tongue. "Hutch, keep moving. It's a trick. It's the mockingbird." "Maggie," Hutch whispered, the word escaping his lips like a prayer. "I'm right here, Harry," the voice pleaded, sounding impossibly close now, as if the speaker were standing just beyond the veil of the swirling snow. "I'm hurt. Please come get me. It's so dark under the rocks." "Hutch, don't do it!" I screamed, grabbing his collar and violently yanking him backward. "She's not there. She's dead." The physical jolt snapped the veteran ranger out of his trance. The despair in his eyes hardened instantly into a molten, furious rage. He pivoted his torso toward the tree line, leveled the Winchester 12 gauge, and pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun was deafening, a concussive shockwave that physically punched the air out of my lungs. A massive blast of 00 buckshot shredded the darkness, illuminating the falling snow in a brilliant, violent flash of muzzle fire. In that fraction of a second of illumination, I saw it. It wasn't just one creature. Hanging from the branches of the ancient pines, crouched atop the granite boulders, and standing completely still in the snowdrifts were at least 4 separate, elongated figures. They were all impossibly tall, their pale, smooth flesh stark against the dark wood, and they were all wearing the clothes of the missing. I saw a faded blue 1990s Patagonia fleece. I saw a child's red winter coat. And in the center, shredded by the buckshot, the figure wearing Tommy Carter's yellow rain shell shrieked in digital agony, falling backward into the dark. "Racket, move!" Hutch bellowed, pumping the action of the shotgun. An empty red shell casing ejected, spinning into the snow. The mockingbird wasn't a single anomaly, it was a species, or a hive mind, and we had just stumbled directly into their hunting grounds. We scrambled up the final, brutal incline. The trees began to thin, giving way to the sheer, exposed granite face of Onyx Peak itself. The wind here was apocalyptic, threatening to tear us right off the mountain. "There," Hutch pointed with the barrel of the shotgun. Set into the solid stone face of the mountain, barely visible beneath a thick layer of ice and snow, was a heavy archway of reinforced concrete. Spanning the archway was a massive grid of rusted 2-inch thick iron bars. It was the entrance to the Iron-Hold Shaft, a silver and copper mine abandoned in the 1920s. We threw ourselves against the icy rock face, finding brief, glorious shelter from the wind in the shallow alcove of the mine entrance. Hutch dug frantically into the deep pockets of his parka, pulling out a heavy ring of brass keys. From the tree line below us, the shrieking began. It sounded like a dial-up modem being fed through a distortion pedal, a deafening, overlapping cacophony of digital rage and human agony. They were coming up the ridge. "Hutch, hurry," I gasped, pressing my back against the rock, watching the tree line. Dark, spindly shapes were detaching themselves from the shadows, moving with horrifying, spider-like speed over the deep snow. They didn't sink into the drifts, they skittered over the top of the powder, their weight displaced by their unnatural geometry. Hutch jammed a key into the massive rusted padlock securing the grate. He twisted with brutal force. The lock groaned, a shower of red rust falling into the snow, and popped open. He ripped the padlock free, grabbed the frozen iron bars, and hauled the grate open. Get in, he yelled. I threw myself through the opening, stumbling over the rusted rails of the old minecart track and collapsing onto the damp stone floor. Hutch followed a second later, grabbing the grate and slamming it shut just as the first creature reached the alcove. The iron bars clanged with the finality of a prison door. Hutch frantically wrapped a heavy steel chain around the crossbars, snapping the padlock back into place and spinning the tumblers. A heavy, sickening thud rattled the grate. I scrambled backward, pushing myself away from the entrance. Pressed against the other side of the iron bars was the creature wearing Tommy Carter's ruined jacket. Its smooth, featureless face was shoved forcefully into the gap between the thick iron rods. It had no eyes, but I could feel the malevolent weight of its gaze. The vertical slit of its mouth peeled open, revealing rows of translucent, needle-like teeth coated in the black fluid. It reached a long, pale arm through the bars, its talons swiping blindly at the empty air, trying to reach Hutch's coat. "Harry," the creature whispered. The voice of Hutch's dead wife echoed flawlessly in the cavernous acoustics of the mine shaft. "Why did you lock me out, Harry? Let me in. They're hurting me." Hutch stepped back, his chest heaving. He didn't raise the shotgun. He just stared at the abomination with a look of profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Maggie died of an aneurysm 12 years ago in a hospital bed in Portland," Hutch said, his voice terrifyingly calm, addressing the monster directly. "You are nothing but a parasite. You have no power here." The creature hissed, a sound of pure, venomous frustration. It gripped the iron bars with both hands and pulled. The thick, 2-inch steel groaned under the impossible pressure, but the 1920s industrial forging held firm. Unable to breach the threshold, the creature slowly backed away, retreating into the swirling snow. Several other pale, elongated shapes flanked it, their forms fading into the whiteout, until there was nothing left but the howling of the blizzard. We were sealed inside. The absolute darkness of the mine shaft was immediate and suffocating. The air was dead, smelling of ancient dust, oxidized iron, and damp earth. Without the wind chilling my wet clothes, the ambient temperature of the cave, around 50 degrees, felt like a tropical oasis to my hypothermic body. A sharp crack echoed through the tunnel, followed by a sudden hiss. A neon green glow flooded the immediate area. Hutch had snapped a military-grade chemlight. He tossed it onto the stone floor, painting the walls in an eerie, sickly luminescence. "Sit up, Thorne. Let me look at that arm," Hutch ordered, dropping his pack and pulling out a heavy red trauma kit. I propped myself against the curved stone wall. The adrenaline was rapidly draining from my system, leaving behind a profound, nauseating wave of pain. The laceration on my forearm was deep, cutting through the muscle fascia, though miraculously it had missed the brachial artery. "Talk to me, Chicago," Hutch said, pulling out a pair of trauma shears and cutting away the ruined, blood-soaked sleeve of my jacket. "You're the medic. Walk me through it. My hands are too numb to feel the tension." I took a ragged breath, forcing my clinical brain to take over. "Irrigate it first. Saline flush. Get that black shit out of the wound. It burns." Hutch popped the cap off a bottle of sterile saline and ruthlessly squeezed it into the open gash. I bit down on my collar to muffle my own scream as the cold liquid washed over the exposed nerves. "Good," I panted, sweat beading on my freezing forehead. "Now pack it. Hemostatic gauze. Quick clot if you have it. You have to shove it deep into the wound bed. Don't be gentle." Hutch didn't flinch. He ripped open a package of Quick Clot combat gauze and began packing the ribbon directly into the laceration, applying brutal, necessary pressure. The chemical agent reacted with my blood, generating a localized heat that felt like a branding iron. I squeezed my eyes shut, my head thumping against the stone wall. "Wrap it tight. Pressure dressing. Figure 8 around the forearm," I instructed, my voice weak. Hutch bound the arm efficiently, securing it with medical tape. He then tossed me 2 heavy, foil-wrapped emergency blankets. "Wrap up, both of them. We need to trap whatever body heat you have left." I cocooned myself in the mylar blankets, the crinkling sound echoing loudly down the shaft. I looked over at Hutch. The veteran ranger was sitting on a rusted wooden crate, the shotgun resting across his knees, staring blankly at the green chem light. "They used her voice," I said quietly. "Maggie." Hutch didn't look at me. "She used to come up here with me on weekends, back in the 90s. She loved this forest. We used to camp down near the throat." He paused, rubbing a calloused hand over his face. "When she passed, it broke me. I spent 6 months out here, alone, looking for a reason not to put my service weapon in my mouth. The forest knows that. It reads the electromagnetic signatures of our brains. It finds the deepest, most agonizing memories, and it projects them back to us. It's an evolutionary hunting trait. They're anglerfish, Elias, and our empathy is the glowing lure." "How long have they been here?" I asked, pulling the mylar tighter around my shivering shoulders. "Longer than the ranger service," Hutch replied grimly. "The indigenous tribes wouldn't come up this ridge. They called this area the Valley of Borrowed Tongues. The government tried to mine it anyway, built this shaft in 1918. They shut it down 4 years later. Officially, the vein ran dry. Unofficially, 20 miners went down into the lower levels and never came back up. The rescue party found nothing but their clothes folded neatly in the dark. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. I looked past Hutch, staring down the long, throat-like expanse of the tunnel. The green light of the chem stick only illuminated about 30 feet before the darkness swallowed the tracks entirely. "We're safe in here, though, right?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "They can't break that iron grate." "No," Hutch said, checking the action on his shotgun one more time. "The iron holds them. They hate the metal. It disrupts their electromagnetic field. We sit tight, we wait for morning, and we radio for a heavily armed medevac when the storm breaks the interference." I nodded, resting my head back against the stone. For the first time in hours, I felt a tiny fraction of the tension release from my shoulders. The mockingbirds were locked outside in the storm. We had shelter, we had medical supplies, we had a chance. I closed my eyes, intending to rest for just 5 minutes, and then I heard it. It was faint, echoing up from the absolute, crushing blackness of the mine shaft behind us. Clink. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath. Hutch froze, his hand tightening on the grip of his shotgun. We both turned our heads, staring down the dark, cavernous throat of the tunnel. Clink. It was the distinct, metallic sound of a heavy iron pickaxe striking solid stone. It was rhythmic, methodical, deliberate. Clink, clink. "Hutch," I whispered, the blood draining from my face. "Tell me that's water dripping." Hutch slowly stood up, raising the shotgun and aiming it down the black tunnel. He reached to his tactical vest and unclipped a high-powered flare and cracked it against the rock. The flare hissed violently, erupting in a blinding crimson glare that pushed the shadows back another 50 feet. The light illuminated the rusted tracks, the crumbling wooden support beams, and the dark, wet stone of the walls. And standing at the very edge of the red light, about 60 feet down the tunnel, was a figure. It wasn't a mockingbird. It wasn't tall or pale or naked. It was a man. He was wearing heavy canvas overalls coated in a century of coal dust and dried mud. He wore a rusted tin helmet with a shattered glass headlamp. In his hands, he held a heavy iron pickaxe raised above his head. He wasn't facing the wall of the mine. He was facing us. And from the shadow beneath the rim of his helmet, a voice echoed down the tunnel. It wasn't the mimicked, synthesized voice of a creature trying to sound human. It was a perfectly human, exhausted, raspy voice. "We've been digging for a long time, boys," the figure said, his voice dripping with an ancient, bone-deep sorrow. "But there ain't no way out." The figure raised the pickaxe and took a slow, heavy step toward us. We had locked the predators outside, but we had locked ourselves in the tomb. The red glare of the emergency flare flickered, throwing jagged shadows against the wet stone of the iron-holed shaft. The figure standing 60 feet away didn't breathe. It wore 1920s canvas overalls, holding an iron pickaxe with mechanical rigidity. As it stepped into the light, the shattered glass of its tin helmet revealed the truth. There was no face, just a dense, writhing bloom of black, fibrous fungus. Thick roots pulsed inside the empty eye sockets and plunged down into its collar. The mountain hadn't just killed the trapped miners a century ago. It had infected them. It wore their bodies like suits. "We've been digging," the thing rasped. The voice wasn't mimicked. It was human, vibrating from the fungal cords inside its chest. "But there ain't no way out." It charged, moving with terrifying, jerky speed. "Fire!" I screamed. Hutch pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the 12-gauge in the enclosed shaft knocked the air from my lungs. The buckshot obliterated the creature's chest, sending a cloud of black spores and petrified wood into the air. It crashed onto the rusted tracks, but it didn't die. The shattered torso began to twitch, the fungal tendrils violently knitting the damage back together. And from the absolute blackness behind it, the sound multiplied. Clink, clink, clink. 20 men had vanished here in 1922. Now 20 petrified husks stepped into the crimson halo, pickaxes scraping the stone. They moved in perfect synchronization, a hive mind of geological horror. I pressed my back against the locked iron grate, turning to look out into the raging Oregon blizzard. Pressed against the other side of the bars were 3 mockingbirds. They clung to the iron, their pale, faceless heads tilting as they watched us. "Come out and play, Elias," one whispered, using the voice of a little boy. "It's so warm out here." We were trapped. The fungal miners were the mountain's stomach, and the mockingbirds were the teeth. Hutch took a slow step back, joining me at the grate. He looked at the advancing horde, then back at the predators in the snow. He let out a heavy sigh, not of fear, but of profound, devastating acceptance. "Elias," Hutch said, his voice returning to a steady, quiet rumble, "you are going back to Chicago. You are going to live in a city with millions of people and concrete. You are never going to set foot in a forest again. We have to fight." I panicked, clutching my bleeding, useless left arm. "There is no fighting this," he replied calmly. He reached deep into his parka and pulled out a heavy cylinder. It was a Type 4 avalanche charge. He gripped the electronic detonator tightly. "Hutch, no. Rule number 4, kid," Hutch said, looking me dead in the eye. You survive. The mockingbirds ate the iron. The blast will disorient them, but it won't kill them. You will have exactly 30 seconds to run. Do not look back. He turned, jammed his keys into the padlock, and ripped the heavy chain off the grate. Harry, please, the mockingbird whispered in his dead wife's voice. Go to hell, Hotch spat. He hauled the grate open, grabbed my collar with hysterical strength, and shoved me violently backward into the howling blizzard. I hit the deep snow, tumbling down the incline. The mockingbirds swarmed instantly, unhinging their jaws. But Hutch didn't close the grate. He stepped out into the threshold, wrapped his massive arms around the lead creature, and tackled the screaming abomination backward into the dark mouth of the mine. Run, Chicago! Hutch roared from the dark. He hit the detonator. The explosion was catastrophic. A blinding flash of yellow-white fire vaporized the darkness. The concussive shockwave lifted me entirely out of the snowdrift, throwing me 30 feet down the mountain. The structural integrity of the 1920s mine failed instantly. Thousands of tons of granite and ice collapsed inward with a horrifying roar, burying the iron grate, the miners, the mockingbirds, and Harrison Miller. He had sealed the tomb. I lay in the snow, my eardrums blown out. The world was utterly, terrifyingly silent. I wanted to close my eyes and sleep. My core temperature was gone. But Hutch's voice echoed in the silent theater of my mind. You survive. I forced myself to stand. I didn't look back. I tucked my chin into my chest and staggered blindly down the slope. Every time my body begged me to stop, I pictured the look of absolute peace in Hutch's eyes right before he pushed the button. Hours later, the sky shifted to a bruised indigo. The blizzard was finally dying. As I stumbled through a grove of massive cedars, my blurred vision caught a glimpse of something to my left. It was the staircase. Pristine mahogany, crimson carpet, sitting in the middle of the wilderness. It glowed warmly, smelling of a wood-burning fireplace and hot coffee. I didn't even pause. I kept my eyes locked on my boots and kept walking. The mountain was out of empathy to harvest. I was completely empty. Eventually, the incline leveled out. My boots hit asphalt. I had reached the Onyx Peak access road. I collapsed onto the double yellow line. A heavy vibration traveled through the pavement, and blinding halogen headlights cut through the morning fog. A massive yellow county snowplow hissed to a halt just feet from me. A man in an orange jacket jumped out, shouting words I couldn't hear, his hands frantically checking my pulse. I let my head fall back against the freezing road and finally allowed the darkness to take me. 6 months later, I sat on the balcony of my fifth-floor apartment in downtown Chicago. Below me, the city roared. The Dan Ryan Expressway was a river of lights. Sirens wailed. The L train shook the foundation. Millions of people packed together, making an incredible amount of noise. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. I lifted my coffee mug with my right hand. My left arm rested in my lap, a scarred, numb claw saved only by 12 hours of surgery to remove the necrotic tissue. I lost 3 toes to frostbite. The official report stated Hutch and I were caught in an avalanche while searching for Tommy Carter. Hutch was declared dead. Tommy's empty clothes were found weeks later, officially ruled an animal attack. I didn't tell the investigators about the mockingbirds or the fungal miners. They would have put me in a psych ward. I simply signed my resignation and took the first flight home. I don't go into the woods anymore. I keep my television on 24 hours a day, filling my apartment with the comforting, mindless babble of humanity. Because sometimes, usually around 3 a.m, the city goes quiet. The traffic dies down. A heavy silence settles over my apartment, mimicking the suffocating vacuum of the Oregon wilderness. And in those quiet moments, my radio alarm clock will softly click on. It won't play a station. It will just play a low hiss of static. And underneath the static, if I listen closely enough, I can hear a choir of voices speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. Rule number 3, Elias. Why didn't you walk east? I never turn off the lights anymore, and I never, ever, answer the door when someone knocks.